1. I'm Andrew Gibbons, which I usually am, and today I have once again and ever welcome as a conversation partner Rebecca Norton, and today we've set ourselves the task of looking at, if not all of these in equal measure, then certainly those which appear to be, certainly by my practice of many, many years, the most accessible, the most useful in a variety of contexts. So I'm not going to launch into a longer speech than that. We'll just see where this takes us. So Rebecca, as ever, tell us about yourself, tell us what you do, and kick us off on this one.
Good morning, Andrew. Yeah, it's Rebecca Norton from Sense of Direction, and delighted to be here with you again. I really like this principles of behaviour, and this is something that I'd not come across specifically. Aspects of it I had, and I was really pleased when you introduced me to it. So I'm keen to know how you've used these principles of behaviour in your work.
Oh, well, you start me off with a tough one. I thought I'd just be able to blather on about it and whatever. Yeah, but you're right. It's all very well to know things, but it's the use of them, isn't it, that matters most. And this is a model which I attribute to Peter Honey. It's very powerful. It's very accessible. It's very flexible. It's generic. You can use it in a variety of contexts and with different people of all levels and types of position and so on. And yeah, I've used it a lot. And there's 3 or 4 of these in particular that I use. And when I use it, Rebecca, I don't just talk about it, I explain it to people. If I'm, for instance, working on negotiation skills, conflict management, interpersonal skills, which is what this is, really, I'm very explicit and overt about it. I will say, let's explore this statement. Let's see what you think of this. So it isn't just something that I do, it's something which I present to people as a model. And I find when you're most explicit with it, it has the most value because people say, okay, let's talk about that then. I wish they would, but let's put up with you talking about it then, Andrew, or whatever it is. So yes, I do use it, and I use it very explicitly and overtly.
Excellent. And I can see how that could be used in a number of different situations, actually. And for me, there's a few things there that stand out for me in terms of the links with NLP. So I've done my NLP practitioner, and there's certainly things there about all behaviour is motivated. That for me sort of feels very similar to one of the premises that we use in NLP is that all behaviour has a positive intention. And that's not necessarily meaning that it has a positive outcome, but that there is some agenda behind behaviour. And I think that's a really helpful one, isn't it, for people to understand, is that not necessarily that somebody's doing anything deliberately to them. It's more about the person who's exhibiting that behaviour and what is it that's motivating them, or what is it that they're intending to get from it. So I can see that being quite a useful one to understand.
Yeah, I mean, it's logical to perhaps take these in order and see where we go with it. I think it's good points you raised already. I don't think behaviour is random. And I think getting people to understand that not only their own behaviour, but just as importantly, the behaviour of others is not random. There is something behind it, as you say. There's an agenda. We don't always know what it is. We sometimes know what it is and pretend to ourselves it's something different. Sometimes we aren't able to articulate what it is. Sometimes we aren't able to ourselves understand or truly tie down what it is that's driving behaviour. I don't know why I do that. I just have to behave like this, I can't stop myself. How often do we hear these sorts of things? And that's a denial of being able to actually take responsibility for your behaviour. So I think the first one is important. I think it's a good place to start.
Yeah, definitely. And I think you sort of hit something on the head there with regard that some people don't even realise that there is a motivation behind their own behaviour. We pick up a lot of things in childhood, what serves us and helps us in a particular situation, and so it just becomes ingrained in who we are. So as an adult, we brought that into adulthood, not necessarily being completely aware of that's why we're doing a behaviour. And I think that's where it can be really helpful to understand. So for example, if I was interacting with somebody and they were behaving in a way that I didn't see as appropriate or logical, it's not about me, it's more about them, and why is it that they're behaving in that way? What is it that's triggering that in them? And trying to understand that sometimes can really help to improve communication as well, I find.
Yeah, it can. I found the same thing. It can also make people sometimes feel very uncomfortable because the nearer they get to an honest appraisal sometimes of what could be perceived to be, it's not me judgmental here, unhelpful behavior. I mean, I interrupt a lot. And I know I interrupt a lot, and I put it down to an over-eagerness and enthusiasm. Sometimes I interrupt and I think, well, I know I did that, and that's because I like what the person just said, and I've got to get in there. But really, I should sit back and show more respect. So even though you're aware of what motivates behavior, it's a hard job sometimes to work on changing that.
Yeah, it is. And I think for me, I always say to my clients is awareness is the key to transformation. You have to be aware of something first before you can actually change it. You know, and like we just touched on before, some people aren't even aware that they're doing things in a particular way. So until you get to that point where you're fully aware of your behavior, you can't do anything about changing it necessarily. I think that's a big thing to understand as well.
I'm going to be really conscious now about interrupting, having said that, so I do too much. But yeah, and I think some people are not only unaware, Rebecca, they're in denial. No, I don't do that. Well, hang on a minute, I've known you for years. You do that. So when you get people make an outright denial or rebuttal of what you see and what you observe, that's a hard place to be sometimes.
It is, and like you said, it's very uncomfortable. As well, I think sometimes, you know, hearing some home truths is not always pleasant, but if we can take that in a spirit of learning, then I think that can be helpful. And again, I think that helps us when we're interacting with other people as well. So sometimes we may need to challenge people on their behavior, but do it in a way that is helpful rather than just critical. And that can really change the way we communicate with each other.
I think so. And of course, it's not one-dimensional, is it? I mean, we're talking about the person, the client, if you like, the person we're working with. I think it's just as important to get that person we're working with to see that other people's behavior is motivated. That if we can only understand where they're coming from, we might be in a better position to at least be informed about their behavior and why they behave in a certain way. And I don't think people think in that way. I mean, I'm probably being very unfair to people, my own human race, for goodness sake, but I actually believe that it's rare for a person to think in this way about their own and perhaps even especially sometimes someone else's behavior. Why did they do that? Well, hang on a minute, think about it, ask about it, explore it. If you're not clear about it, show an interest in it and discover why someone's behaving in a way that you can't understand.
Yeah, and it's interesting. I mean, as a coach, that's one thing that is really important to me, is to actually understand the motivations behind people and their behavior and what it is that's driving them and things. And I suppose I almost sort of take that for granted if that's something that I'm very curious about. What is it that's motivating this behaviour? What is it that's keeping you going and doing these things? Where perhaps you're right, with other people, sometimes we get caught up in how it's made us feel and the impact on us, rather than actually trying to understand the other person and understand where they're coming from and what is it that's motivating them. And I think when you're working in a team, that's really helpful to understand, right, what is it that's driving us as a team, or what is it that's driving my manager, what is it that's motivating this company, you know, what is it that we are trying to aim for.
I think so. I think at the heart of this for me, as I think about this, it's about the depth of interest, it's about the degree of value that's perceived in doing this, as opposed to just doing stuff. And I think there's a lot of superficiality about behavior. And I think if we did some of the stuff you're talking about, thought about our own, thought about others, explored it where it's unclear, asked questions of people without being intrusive, to respectfully and interestedly and authentically question, you know, where are you coming from on this? I want to know what you want to get from this. We tend to make assumptions, and those assumptions are so wrong so often. If only we showed a bit more interest in exploring where someone's coming from, we'd be in a better position to have a meaningful conversation.
Very much so, and I like you said, it demonstrates that respect, but it's also about being interested, genuinely being interested in somebody else, isn't it?
Yeah, it is.
It's genuinely taking interest. What is it that this person wants from this?
Yeah.
How can we help each other? There's that sort of almost that collaboration aspect,
Yeah,
I think, as well from that.
It is, and to not do that results in the sort of conversations we so rarely see, where there's inadequate or wrong assumptions made of people's behavior, and relationships don't develop positively because that respectful interest isn't shown. So, well, that's a surprise. I didn't think we get 10 minutes out of the first one. This could be one of our longer conversations. Let's move on, if only because we might get through these. If we don't, we can pick them up another time. Let's not rush them. Let's give them the time they need. The second one for me is very, very powerful. It's the one which I've found people can relate to probably the most once you explain what it's about. It's 3 words. It doesn't take too much understanding. It's about how our own behavior can influence, sometimes dictate almost, what we get from someone else, and vice versa. That how someone behaves towards us has very often such a strong influence on what they get back from us. I listen to you, I show interest in you, I expect you to show interest in me. Doesn't always happen, and that's something else that I need to explain with people very often. Just because you're working on your own behavior consciously, deliberately, don't always expect that same behavior back. It's frustrating when you listen, someone else doesn't. When you don't interrupt, someone else does. When you ask interested questions, someone else doesn't. So sometimes you've got to counteract the behavior breeds behavior thing. I'm not getting back what I'm giving. But irrespective, it's how the impact of one person or people impacts on another, whether it's from yourself or you're the receiver of it.
Yeah, very much so. I think it's that reflection, isn't it? It's that mirroring of what you put out is what you receive back. And for me, I can see links in different things with this. And for me, this is a linked to sort of law of attraction stuff in some respects, in that what you give out is what comes back to you. And even if you don't get it straight away, you're demonstrating, like you've just said, by listening to somebody and giving them space, you're demonstrating to them what you value. Even if you don't get that back straight away, it's setting a good example for the person, isn't it? So if we want somebody to behave in a particular way, then we have to demonstrate it and lead by example if we want to get that back.
Yeah, and I think there's again what we said earlier, there's an issue here around the perception, a word we'll come on to in a bit, of our own behavior. Sometimes we have a misperception of our behavior. We think we're behaving in a certain way when actually it's perceived as something different. So these interrelate. They clearly do. I think in terms of behavior breeds behavior, for Coronation Street watchers that go back as long as I do, I've watched it for some years since it got, in my view, rather stupid. But when I was watching it, good old Mike Baldwin, there's a name that people of a certain Coronation Street era would remember. Mike Baldwin was once asked in The Rover's Return, why do you look so happy all the time? Why are you smiling and all the time? He says, hey, he says, smiling away, you don't kick a dog that's wagging its tail. And salespeople know that. Salespeople know that if they behave confidently, if they project interest, very often what they don't feel, if they smile and look confident, then they're more likely to make a sale. And Mike Baldwin was a salesman.
Yeah, definitely. And I think this is something that's useful for managers and leaders of an organisation to be aware of as well. Sometimes, for me, I'm particularly interested in well-being and looking after people's well-being and stuff. And there is a big agenda around that now. And some organisations claim to be interested in their employees' well-being, but it's often lip service rather than actual demonstration of we are genuinely interested in your well-being. I work part-time at the minute for an organisation, and I have to say that they do demonstrate a genuineness when it comes to our well-being, and that's portrayed right from the top down, from our CEO, chief exec person. He is very much interested in his employees' well-being, and that's where the behaviour breeds behaviour is really important in an organisation as well, isn't it? If you want to develop that culture, you have to demonstrate it yourself.
Yeah, interesting. I think you might have created a new 3-letter abbreviation, TLA there, a chief executive person, a CEP. Yeah, it's interesting you take that line. It's not one I often think about enough. I tend to think of these things transactionally, and very often as person to person. But you are absolutely right. It can be a collective thing. Behavior breeds behavior can be a corporate thing. It can be a whole organization thing, a unit thing. It can be a team thing. It can be a collective as well as an individual thing. It's about, does this organization, like you say, behave in a certain way that brings different behaviors back? I also know of organizations where the espoused values are totally contrary to actual, and behavior get back from staff is, oh yeah, where do we see this, blah blah blah. So whatever form the behavior is and wherever it comes from, however collective or individual, it has an impact on what you get back. I think it's almost irrefutable. Behavior doesn't just happen randomly and in a vacuum. Behavior is the consequence of other behavior.
Yeah, definitely. And I think this is where, if you if you get up in the morning, it was interesting, I was reflecting on this the other day. If you get up in the morning feeling really grumpy and you leave the house in a grumpy state, you will find things throughout your day that will make you even more grumpy. So I think this is where it's really important to shake that off. And this, I suppose, in some respects for me, leads on to the next one. You can choose your behavior.
Sure.
This is the time where you choose to think, okay, if I continue down this grumpy vein, I'm not going to have a good day. So I'm going to choose to behave in a different way.
Well, I think so. And let's go on to it in a minute. But I just want to pick up one more thing on behavior breeds behavior. And I think that is that human beings, in my observation, which, with all those qualifications, is only Andrew's observations of only those people he's ever witnessed and only what I think I see. So lots of qualifications. But I think human beings, in terms of behavior breeds behavior, there is very often a very long-term effect here. Yes, it's transactional sometimes. You interrupt me, I interrupt you. You show interest in me and smile at me, I'm going to give you that back. So it's transactional, but it's also very embedded. There are people that I think a certain way about, fairly or unfairly, now that is the same as I thought about them 30 years ago. There are things people have done to me that I have not forgiven, and that is embedded in me. So sometimes it is not only transactional, it is long-term impact.
Yeah, that's a good point, actually. And I think that's a really good demonstration of it, isn't it? Is sometimes, unfortunately, if you set off on the wrong footing with somebody, you've already sort of set up that relationship to not go very well.
Families too often have irretrievable breakdowns of relations, and that's regrettably true of my own. I think I'm going to find it hard to find the behaviors that could repair some relationships, because what's happened thus far is, in my view, irreparable. So behavior breeding behavior isn't a magic ticket, and I think we've got to be realistic that a lot of behavior is so embedded and is so immovable that you just can't break out of that. So I think the whole behavior breeding behavior thing is more than transactional, it's relationship based as well.
Yeah, definitely agree.
Right, before I sort of go into a family therapy session, so you're moving us into, you can choose your behaviour, and I think we're going to get more from this one as well than I might have expected, because one of my big ones is coming next, but let's stay on this one. What do you make of you can choose your behaviour?
I think people aren't always aware I don't think people are always aware that they have as much choice over their behaviour as they think. I think some people, believe that they're driven to behave in a particular way because of somebody else, but ultimately, most of the time when you react to somebody, they're not holding a gun to your head, they're not making you do that. You are choosing to respond in a particular way. And I'm not saying it's necessarily easy to choose your behaviour, but it is possible. And I think there is, if you can recognise that, it puts you in an empowered position to be more responsible.
I absolutely agree. I don't think we're a victim of our behaviour, and I think the broader you can range of behaviour. I very often talk about behavioural repertoires and being really sophisticated in my thinking. I stand at the flip chart and I put on one end nice and the other end nasty, and with a line. I said, okay, we've all got a range of behaviours in here that we find comfortable, that is our normal range. And then we got a range we can stretch into. And then there's a part that we can no more change in ourselves than jump over this building backwards. So I've worked with people who seem absolutely stuck in being too nice. They'll let people walk all over them. They won't stand up for themselves. They won't They won't do what others do in terms of just standing up for their rights. They're too nice. And then I've seen people who are outrageously nasty.
Yeah.
And know they are sometimes, but have no desire whatsoever to be other than nasty, because for them it works. So then you come across people, and I've only met two, we've talked about them before, I think, who are dangerous individuals that can move from one end to the nice to nasty scale, bing, 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 instantly and comfortably. And they are dangerous because they've got the whole lot. Most of us, I think you're right, have got a range of behavior which is our comfortable, habitual range, and in there we tend to stay.
Yeah, and I think you've touched on it there, is that habitual thing. The reason we behave in a particular way often is because we've got into a habit of behaving in a particular way, not necessarily because we're consciously doing it. And this is where, you know, a lot of these things that we're talking about, they're not necessarily easy things to change, but they are possible to change. And I think it takes a lot of inner work, is what I would call it, to adjust some of these things. And it's really important for me to help people understand that they can choose their behavior, because that puts you in a position of control and power. If you say, I can't do it because this is just how I respond, you're giving away your power and your control. And I think that is really not helpful to anybody.
Well, absolutely so. And I think it takes a for me, you know, I mean, again, how do I know what anyone else is like? I've tried consciously to think in this way. Only I know how I think it is. I don't know what it's like for you, or people walking down the street, look out the window, or even my cat that's lying down there on a padded envelope. He likes padded envelopes. So where I'm coming from here is only we can identify what we believe to be our own range. And I think there's a real value in doing this at a very conscious level. I mean, I think words in my head. I don't know if other people do. I sometimes think, hang on, what should I do here? Hang on, I've fallen into this trap before. Let's ask a question here rather than give a statement. I actually think in that way. I try consciously to choose my behavior, so consciously that I'm talking to myself in my head.
Yeah, but again, that's that awareness, isn't it? We have to be aware of our own behavior before we're able to change it. And I think sometimes it's just, to start off with, it's just understanding that we can choose our behavior. It might not be easy, but we can choose a behavior. And that's where you need to take a step back and say, like you've just identified, is actually, do I want to behave in this way? Do I want to respond in this way? How else could I respond? What are my options? And just talking yourself through some different scenarios can be really helpful to managing difficult situations as well.
I agree. When did we ever disagree? And I think for me, this relates to reflection as well. I've written recently about 3 forms of reflection: reflecting forward, reflecting in the moment, reflecting backwards. And for me, part of this is planning to choose, if you're able to, if it's something which is scheduled, which you know you're going to do, it might be a conversation, it might be a meeting, is to say, right, when have I behaved unhelpfully here? When in the past have I upset people here? Let's not do that. And I think more conscious and aware we are, as you say, of how we behaved previously, the more likely it is that we can behave more positively in the future.
Yeah, and it's good that you've linked that to the reflection thing, because I know we've talked about the reflection thing before. So if you know that you're going into an environment that is likely to cause a particular reaction in you that you'd rather not have, if we reflect forward and think, okay, well, this has happened previously on a number of occasions, I don't want it to go this way this time. How can I choose to behave differently? What will I need to do if they say this, or if this happens? What can I do differently? You know, it's just giving yourself that bit of space, isn't it, sometimes, to think things through that can be really helpful and make all the difference.
I think so. And again, these relate, don't they? Because in recognizing that we can choose our behavior, then we're recognizing sometimes that there's a motivation behind that. We can choose our behavior, but I find that so difficult because I want this to happen, or I've always behaved like this. So we're fighting ourselves sometimes, I think. This is tough. You're right. It is tough. You mentioned it earlier. I've worked with people who very deliberately and very mischievously just hit other people's hot buttons, as I call them.
Yes.
And they'll directly wink at you and say, watch this. And they'll say something and bang, someone will react. Hey, and they think, yeah, because they know they can do that.
Yeah. Which is not always the best thing to do.
seen it in meetings. I thought, oh no, I know exactly what you've done there. You've said that word that makes them react like this. And then when we all get a break for 3 minutes while they just sound off.
Yeah, definitely. But and that's where it comes down to the responsibility of everybody involved, doesn't it, really? Is that we can all choose to not allow our buttons to be pressed or whatever, although that might be difficult. If you know that that is a button in you, then how can you learn to not allow it to be a trigger in future? Yeah.
It's so tough because then you're hitting your biases, your unconscious biases, or all the things that we don't even know we're doing. Least of all, able to control because they work so much more quickly through our brain than we can actually even perceive. This is hard to do. So let's move on to perception is reality. It's another one of my favorites.
Yeah.
This whole business of understanding that people see things differently than we do, and there's no rights and wrongs. One of the frustrations for me that I see in myself and in others is that people don't see things the way we do.
Yeah. And so we can look at the same situation and you get people to relate what's just happened, and it's almost like two completely different stories.
Absolutely.
And I think that's fascinating.
I do too.
Actually, it's like we're just in the same room as, have you just seen what I've just seen?
Yeah, absolutely. We've recently had two shouting politicians in America, and the one of them, the shouty one, has been saying, "Wow, I won that." I thought, "No, you didn't, mate. You looked a complete prat." And because it's all down to our own values, beliefs, and that sort of stuff. That's what guides how we see something. And when those values and beliefs are in opposition with others, that surely causes a different perception.
Yeah, definitely. And also, I think it's, again, this is where it can be really helpful for us to understand somebody else, because if we can sort of understand what their perception is. So say, for example, we've gone into a situation and then we realise that actually they're not seeing things from our point of view. And that's when we become curious and say, well, hang on, can you explain to me what you can see here then, so that I can understand and maybe we can move forwards, rather than sort of coming at it from two completely different angles. So again, it's that curiosity, isn't it? What is it that's real for this person?
Yeah, I think it is. And I think it's more. I think it is definitely that. And I'm thinking it's also about ego and self-esteem and all the things that stop us behaving with humility. Because sometimes we know we're in the wrong. Sometimes we know the other person's position is more valid than our own. And then we come back to all behaviors be motivated, blah, 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 all the others so far, choosing behavior. And can we choose a behavior that says, okay, I've listened to you, I've explored what your position. Do you know what I'm thinking to myself? You're right and I'm wrong on this. How often do we hear people say that?
And that takes a lot of courage to do that. And if people can, there is a much better quality of relationship and quality of communication. It's not a sign of weakness either. I think some people will think that if they have to back down or backtrack on something, that it's a sign of weakness, but it isn't. It's actually a sign of courage to be able to be honest and admit.
No question. I think, again, we're down to assumptions. So many people, I keep being critical of people, but I am, make assumptions. They think they know someone's perception instead of exploring it, instead of establishing it. Salespeople are intuitively good at this. Good ones are. If someone's presenting an obstacle to a sale, if there's a sales objection, that's the word, so I'm not really sales trained, they will not assume what that is. They'll explore it. They'll qualify it. So is it about price? Is it about this? Is it about that? They won't say, oh, I think I know what it is, because they want to know what it is in order to allay that concern and to sell that product. So I think salespeople are strong on this. They don't just make assumptions, they explore it. More normal humans don't do that. And I think that's driven largely by our perception, here we go again, that you're in the right, that somehow that other person needs to see it your way. Well, sometimes it's the reverse.
That's a really good point, actually, about the salespeople, isn't it? Is that they will be curious about, well, what is it that you're seeing, and if we could all do that a little bit more, it would be really helpful. Because the thing is, as we've touched on, you have a situation, you can have 3, 4, 5 different people in that room, in that situation, and they can all give you a very different story. None of them are wrong.
No.
I think that's the other thing. None of them are wrong. They're all true for that person. So I think if we can understand that, and try and find out where it is that they're coming from, it can really help to build a team up and to move forwards together, rather than all trying to argue and win. You know, it's not about winning, is it? It's often about just finding a way to overcome some challenges together, that everybody wins as such.
Well, yeah, and you mentioned the collective again there. If you're working in a meeting, let's be practical here. If there's a meeting and there's 8 or 10 or sometimes far too many more than that in that meeting, as you've said already, there might be as many different perceptions of that thing that's being discussed at that moment. How often do we go to the trouble of establishing everybody in a collective situation's perceptions when it's critically important? How do each of us feel about this? How do each of us see what's going on here right now? We don't hear those sorts of things in meetings. It's let's hurry up, we've got a lot to get through.
Yeah. And again, for me, this links a little bit to an NLP technique of perceptual positions, where you actually replay a situation or conversation from your point of view. You then physically move position to the person that you were in the conversation with, or whatever it was, and you replay the conversation situation from their point of view, imagining what they were going through. And then the third position, is an observer watching the two of you having a conversation. What would an observer see going on there as well? And I found that to be a really powerful exercise. My clients have found that it's enlightening, and sometimes, like you say, unfortunately, sometimes it makes them feel really humble and think, oh, I see, I came across like this, or I understand their point of view now. But if we can do that more often, especially in difficult situations, I think it can really help to improve things.
Yeah, you're taking me back to more than 20 years ago, conversation with a client of mine, John Robinson. I mentioned him, like John, at Cambridge University. He was NLP trained and he was really into all the principles and stuff. And we would have meetings, 3, 4, 5 of us as consultant group. And he would say, right, I'm just going to leave this meeting for a minute and look down like from above. We thought, okay, John's having one of his NLP moments here. Because what he was trying to do is say, let's get a sense of perspective here. Let's move out of me here, part of this, to me looking down on these people and seeing what I see. In negotiation terms, William Ury and Roger Fisher talk about going to the balcony. And the idea there is exactly the same. You go to the balcony, you look down on a situation from a more objective perspective, and you say, is that Andrew Gibbons really behaving like this? You know, is that Rebecca Norton just not getting this? So by going to the balcony or second positioning or whatever it is you do, you're trying to get a sense of objective perspective. Blah, it's easy for me to say. And all of this might sound a bit highfalutin and academic and just get on. But I'll tell you what, it's useful. And if only we actually stopped and questioned some of the fundamentals of why we behave the way we do, we might behave a little better.
Definitely, I think it would improve an awful lot of meetings. A number of meetings that you sit in that are horrendous, and you come out of thinking, oh my, Yeah, definitely. And are we ready to move on to the next one?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, and again, the good thing is that we are interrelating these. We're mentioning earlier ones as we go because they do interrelate. They're not discrete. They're not standalone. They impact on each other, and that's what makes this model so useful. So, okay, take us into the only behaviour you can change is your own.
Yeah, I think this is another good one, and unfortunately, you will get people who will try and manipulate others to do something that they want, and ultimately, we can only change our own behaviour. And I think sometimes people forget that actually, when you change your behaviour, this is where it links to that behaviour breeds behaviour. If I change my behaviour and start acting in a way that is much more amenable to other people, then people will reflect that back to me, and I will change their behaviour by changing my own.
And vice versa. If you do what I just did and cut in inappropriately, if you show disinterest, if you show lack of respect, you're going to get that back.
Yeah, definitely. But it is really interesting. I think if we could all just learn that we can only change our own behaviour rather than trying to force other people, influence them, manipulate them, whatever, again, we could create a much nicer environment in places, couldn't we? and
Yeah,
have
we might
better
have happier families
relations.
too. I don't want to go back into my family situation, but yeah, you're right. Parents understand this. You know, when you hear parents say, "Why don't you listen? Why do you always do?" You know, so if you're calm, you might create more calmness. If you're agitated and you create an anxious environment, that's how your children are going to grow up. So there's lots of environments to use this in, but I think so. And it's frustrating to think that much as we'd like to influence people, to persuade people, we can only do that with what we've got, and all we've got is our own behaviour.
Yeah, yeah, and again, I think that's a really powerful one, because ultimately that puts us back in charge of our life. It puts us back in charge of our circumstances. So you know what, actually, I'm sick of being in this situation or how things are happening. I'm going to do something about it, and I can, because I'm going to change the way I respond or the way I behave in this situation.
And of course, people who try and change their behaviour suddenly or disingenuously will not be credible.
No.
You can't go into a workplace where you've spent 30 years being an autocratic dictator, shouting at people, not listening to them, and going and saying, "Well, how are we all today? Well, what do you hope to get from this week?" Because we think, where the hell did this come from? So to a large degree, I think we're a victim of our past behaviour. That shouldn't stop us from trying to make even incremental changes, because they can, over a time, if we allow them to, become habitual behaviour. But it's hard to break habits.
Yeah, and I think you're right there. I think it needs to be very small steps, because otherwise, one, it doesn't seem genuine, like you said, and I think people sort of question you on that. And two, it's difficult to maintain, because if it's not coming from a genuine place of interest or alignment with your values, then you're not going to be able to keep that up for very long.
Yeah, I think
It is about it's about those really small steps and changes over a gradual amount of time as well. It's not, I always say to people, coaching is not an overnight change. It's a far more gradual, subtle change in things.
Yeah, and I think this is frustrating, isn't it? Because I think a lot of folk would like to think they've got more power over people than they truly have. Well, what else have you got other than your own behaviour? What you say as well as what you do. Put those two things together. That's a powerful influence if you use them consciously, deliberately, and skillfully. Because if you change your behavior unhelpfully, that can go the other way. We're quite properly approaching all of this from a helpful, positive perspective. But if you change your behavior unhelpfully, that can cause a different impact on the people around you.
Yeah, definitely. And I've seen where people have tried to sort of manipulate others, and they may change somebody's behavior for a very short while, but it doesn't build trust. It doesn't build a good relationship. And as soon as that person, leaves or whatever, then they will go back to how they were before, potentially. So yes, I think you really sort of highlighted an important point there, is that all of these things need to be done in an ethical, genuine way that has compassion behind them.
Yeah, well. I think you're right. I mean, I use the word authentic a lot more these days. I seem to like that word, and I'll use it again here. If you are authentic about these things, it will, a lot of people will. Let's not overgeneralize. Some people won't pick that up. But, and again, we're back in the I'm trying to do all the good stuff here mode. And I sometimes say to people I'm working on in an interpersonal skills negotiation type environment, it is frustrating that you're doing all these things and you don't get it back. All you can do is continue to do the right things in the hope that you can actually, sometime down the track, get a bit of what you're looking for, because you're not going to get that unless you do these things.
Yeah, and that's the key, isn't it? It's the consistency and persistence, and just keep going. If you know you're doing the right thing, then keep doing the right thing. It will ultimately lead to better things down the line. It just not necessarily straight away. And it doesn't mean to say that you give up. You keep going with these things. It's going to take a while, but it's also about leaving a positive legacy as well, even if it doesn't necessarily change straight away. You're setting up good habits further on down the line, maybe for other people, and that as well.
What's the alternative to this? To randomly react to events and then wonder why people don't agree with you. This to me is just totally irrefutable. Let's hit the last one. Behavior is situational, meaning that in one situation we'll behave in one way, in another situation we'll behave in another.
Yeah, and again, this to some extent links to all of them, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Behavior situation. If we enter a room or a group that is very welcoming and very supportive, then we're likely to display behavior that is similar, and be welcoming and engaging in that group. However, if same person but goes into a different group which is more hostile and it's not a pleasant environment, then our behavior is going to be different. So there is a lot of context around it, isn't there? And how comfortable you feel will dictate how you behave a lot of the time.
Yeah, I think so. And like you say, it relates to all the others, because we choose our behavior within a certain different range in one situation to others. I've spent 40 years observing people in different contexts and sometimes been genuinely amazed by the skills they use or don't in one situation that I've seen a total contrasting position in another situation, maybe even two workplace situations.
And then, but I think if you see that, did you feel like you could trust them?
Hard to answer immediately.
Did they still come across as genuine? Because I think sometimes I think you can have different views and different ways of behaving depending on the situation.
And sometimes that's very deliberate, Rebecca. I think sometimes people are very recognizing that you can choose your behavior. I think some people, hey, me, maybe you, certainly I'll put hands up to this. I will say, in this situation, I'm going to behave like this. In a different situation, sometimes I say to clients, do something unexpected. In that meeting that you have regularly, show a different behavior than they've seen from you in the past. Not stand up there and kick over furniture and sort of throw a chair through the window. But if they're used to you being a bit passive, make a point at least once to say, I don't agree with that. Or if they're used to you being a bit of a non-listener, sit back, maybe don't say anything at all. Make them think, whoa, I've not seen that person do that before, because that extends your range. I think one of the reasons that behavior is situational is that people consciously or otherwise choose to behave in different ways.
Yeah, definitely. And again, I know we've talked on the introversion extroversion thing, and I would say that I'm more of an introvert, and there are times like when I'm chatting to you, nobody would guess that. I'm quite happy to natter on for ages and ages and get me started on something, and I'm happy. Where in other situations I will sit back and I will observe, I will listen, I will engage occasionally, but not as much. And it's still the same me, but it's in a different situation, and it might just be that I'm not quite as comfortable, or I feel like I just need to be more quiet and observe more. So it does depend a lot on the situation you're in, and the people that you're in the company of as well.
Well, undoubtedly, there's plenty of people, I'm sure, that would consider it reckless and career-threatening to behave in a certain way with chief executive persons, and I know that expression, in the room, than if it were colleagues with whom they can speak candidly, transparently, openly, and, dare I say, truthfully. So I think people do recognize that behavior is situational and do consciously and very deliberately adapt their behavior accordingly. I wonder if they always know they're doing that. And I think if that were a conscious process, it could be done more skillfully.
Yeah, true. And I think as long as it's done in an authentic way, in a genuine way, then I think we all recognize that you will behave differently in different ways. If a person is sort of deliberately trying to do something in one situation, but then deliberately trying to do something else in another situation, I think that's when it comes across as being slightly more disingenuous, and perhaps maybe you wouldn't want to trust somebody. So I've experienced that before, where I've watched somebody interact with one person, and then perhaps I've seen them interact with somebody else later, and I'm thinking, that's not how, which one of you is the real you that's coming across here, So it can work in both ways, can't it?
I think it certainly can. And I think it does relate to things like you can choose your behavior. If
Yes.
someone is appearing to behave unnaturally, disingenuously, then it's possibly because they recognize they're in their stretch zone. They're not behaving in a way that feels natural to them. And that's then being perceived by others as being unnatural.
Yes. Yeah, definitely. It is interesting, isn't it, in that respect. And I like the idea of what you suggested about stretching your range. I think sometimes it is good to push ourselves out of our comfort zone. Again, maybe choosing when to do that and where you are will really help your confidence, because if you push it in the wrong situation, it's just going to knock you back and knock your confidence. So there's times and places that's probably more appropriate to do that than others, isn't there?
I think there is. And I think in kind of summary, though this summary might take some time between us, let's get to a point of concluding. Mm-hmm. What I'm getting from this conversation, which I couldn't have anticipated, is to more consciously and deliberately recognize that it's both sides of a communication, if you like, that it's no good just concentrating on you. You've got to see it from the other person's perspective or other people's. So and then it's tough, isn't it? It's the thing we've said throughout this is none of this is easy. And in fact, as we've unfolded it, it's apparent to me, as someone who has a familiarity with this model, that this is even more difficult than I've probably ever appreciated it being in the past.
Yeah, it is. And again, though, it's one of the things, just because it's not easy doesn't mean to say it's not worth trying. And I think sometimes, unfortunately, people get put off by something that they see is going to be hard work, or it's going to be difficult. Then they think, oh, you know what, I can't be bothered, or I haven't got the energy, or whatever. But if you really work on things, if you really consciously develop things, the quality of your relationships and the quality of your communication will ultimately improve, and long term the benefits are worth it. And I think my worry at the minute is we're in a society where everybody wants things now. It's got to be instantaneous, that desire to have it now. And unfortunately, that's where the problems occur. Sometimes we're not giving things chance to develop and grow and change and stuff. So the fact that it may take a few months, possibly even a couple of years, to change some really bad ingrained habits, I think it sometimes puts people off, and they think, oh, you know what, I haven't got the time, or I haven't got the energy to do this. It's too hard. I'm going to stick with what I'm familiar with.
Well, I couldn't argue against that. And I think one of my favorite learning models is the difficult learning model. So sometimes we go for the immediate, easy stuff, the low-hanging fruit in terms of learning, and we don't have the appetite for the long haul, the things we know are going to be tough. We shy away from that. We have a nibble, it hurts, and we get frightened off. So I think you're right. This is an example of difficult learning. This is an example of the hard slog. But it also can give immediate results, because if you really try and do some of this consciously, you'll get some short hits of, wow, that person, so that's why that person behaves that way. Wow, that person, if you give them a chance, you can have a better conversation with. Wow, that person is more interesting than I thought. If we use our behavior consciously and skillfully, we can get quick results as well as being on a journey.
Yeah, that's actually a really good point. If you walk out the house in the morning and you smile and say hello to people on the way to the bus or on the way to work or when you're getting work, you will have an instantaneously different type of day ahead of you, that rather than that scowl and a grunt that you might give to people if you're having a bad day. That is true. You can get some really quick win benefits from just being conscious about how you're behaving.
And that's too good a place not to finish on that positive note. So thank you once again, Rebecca.
Thank you.